At my wife's funeral, my son David whispered in my ear, "She was a burden, always sick and whining. Now we can finally breathe." I'd rebuilt his life after every failure, paid his gambling debts, covered his mortgage when he got fired, raised his kids when Sandra couldn't handle them. Now he stood over Elizabeth's grave like he was celebrating. I turned to face him, my voice barely audible. "You'd better shut your mouth." In that moment, I stopped being his safety net and became his reckoning. He wanted freedom from Elizabeth's memory? I'd teach him what real burden looked like. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. The line of mourners stretched back from Elizabeth's casket like a river of black fabric and whispered condolences. "She was such a gentle soul," Mrs. Henderson from next door squeezed my hand. "Always had a smile, even through all that pain." Father Mackenzie nodded solemnly as I approached the podium. 20 years of marriage deserved more than silence. "Elizabeth faced every day with grace," I began, my voice catching slightly. "She never complained, not once, even through all that pain. She worried more about being a burden to others than about her own suffering." The congregation murmured in agreement. I caught sight of familiar faces, my coworkers, Elizabeth's book club, neighbors who'd brought casseroles during her worst days. But no David. 20 minutes into the service, the chapel door creaked open. David stumbled in, his suit wrinkled, tie askew, reeking of stale alcohol even from where I stood. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair uncombed. Several heads turned, whispering. Sandra followed behind him, perfectly composed, checking her phone. Relief flooded through me despite everything. He came. After missing her last birthday, after avoiding the hospital for weeks claiming work emergencies, he was here for this final moment. Maybe grief affected people differently. Maybe he'd been drinking to cope with losing her. David made his way to the front pew, dropping heavily beside me. "Sorry, Dad," he mumbled, breath sharp with gin. "Traffic was hell." I nodded, grateful he'd made the effort. When Father Mackenzie invited family to speak, I looked at David. Hopefully. He stared at his phone screen, typing something. Sandra leaned over, whispered in his ear, and they both stifled what looked like laughter. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the eulogy I'd written, the same hands that had held Elizabeth through dialysis sessions 3 times a week, that had learned to monitor her fluid intake and medications, that had driven her to countless specialist appointments hoping for a kidney match that never came. "Thank you all for being here," I concluded. "Elizabeth would have been overwhelmed by your love." David caught up with me as I walked slowly behind the hearse, my legs feeling heavier with each step. The procession moved like a funeral march should, solemn, respectful, honoring the woman who'd spent her last years fighting for every breath. I felt David's presence beside me, and for a brief moment, my heart lifted. Perhaps he wanted to say something meaningful, to acknowledge what we'd lost together. He leaned close, alcohol heavy on his breath, and chuckled softly. "She was a burden, always sick and whining. Now we can finally breathe." The words hit me like ice water. I stopped walking, the procession continuing ahead of us. "You'd better shut your mouth," I whispered, my voice barely audible but carrying the weight of decades of suppressed anger. David straightened up, that familiar smirk spreading across his face, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he thought he was being clever. "What? I'm just being honest, Dad. You can't tell me you didn't think it too, watching her waste away like that." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The same hands that had held Elizabeth's during every dialysis session, that had rubbed her swollen feet when the treatments left her exhausted, that had signed the DNR when the doctors said her kidneys were beyond saving. She was my wife, David. She deserved better than... "Oh, come on." Sandra's voice cut through my words as she appeared beside her husband, perfectly manicured nails glinting as she adjusted her designer purse. "David's just saying what everyone's thinking. She's been dying for years. At least now you can move on with your life." I felt something cold settle in my chest, watching them exchange a look. The same look they'd shared countless times when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The look that said the old man was finally cracking, that their patience with my theatrics was running thin. "Please," I said quietly, "just show some respect. She meant a lot to me." David's expression hardened, all pretense of sympathy vanishing. "Meant a lot to you? She's not even my mother. She was just some woman you got together with after you and Mom divorced. You always put her first, always chose her over your own family." His voice grew louder, drawing glances from other mourners. The words hung in the air like poison. I felt the eyes of every mourner burning into us, felt Father Mackenzie's shocked expression, felt Mrs. Henderson's hand flutter to her mouth in horror. Something snapped inside me. Not grief, not sadness, but pure, white-hot fury. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice cutting through the cemetery air like a blade. "Don't you dare stand at her grave and judge anyone, David. Not when I've spent the last 15 years cleaning up your messes. Your gambling debts? I paid them. Your mortgage when you got fired for showing up drunk? I covered it. Your kids' school fees when you blew their college fund at the casino? Me again." David's smirk faltered slightly, but I wasn't finished. "You want to talk about embarrassment? Try explaining to your neighbors why your 39-year-old son keeps coming to you with his hand out because he can't manage his own life. Elizabeth never asked me for a dime. She worked until she couldn't stand anymore, and even then she worried about being a burden. You?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "You've been nothing but a burden your entire adult life." The words landed like physical blows. I could feel my vision narrowing, my breathing becoming shallow. Around us, the funeral procession had slowed, people turning to look at the commotion. Mrs. Henderson's concerned face appeared in my peripheral vision. Father Mackenzie had stopped walking entirely. "You ungrateful," I started, but David was already backing away, Sandra's hand on his arm. "Come on, honey," Sandra said sweetly, her voice carrying just far enough for others to hear. "Your father needs time to process his grief. We understand." She turned to me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We'll call you later when you're feeling more stable." They walked away together, Sandra's heels clicking against the pavement, David's shoulders shaking with what looked like suppressed laughter. I watched them climb into their Mercedes and drive off, leaving me standing alone on the cemetery path. Slowly, I turned back toward Elizabeth's grave, where the rest of the mourners waited in uncomfortable silence. Father Mackenzie approached cautiously, his eyes full of concern and questions I wasn't ready to answer. But something fundamental had shifted in those few minutes. The grieving widower was stepping aside, making room for someone who understood that some debts required very careful collection. 3 days after Elizabeth's funeral, I sat in our living room holding her favorite coffee mug, the blue ceramic one with tiny white flowers she'd painted during one of her better weeks. The house felt impossibly quiet without the soft hum of her oxygen concentrator, without her gentle voice asking if I needed anything while she was the one who needed everything. I was lost in the memory of Sunday mornings when she'd insist on making pancakes despite my protests, her hands shaking slightly as she mixed the batter, refusing to let her illness steal the small joys she could still give. "Robert," she'd say with that stubborn smile, "let me feel useful while I can." The kitchen would smell like vanilla and cinnamon, and for those brief moments, the dialysis schedule and medication reminders would fade away. The doorbell shattered the memory. David and Sandra stood on my porch looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog, his suit perfectly pressed, her designer handbag matching her heels. Sandra held a small bouquet of grocery store flowers, the kind you grab at checkout. "Dad," David said, his voice carefully modulated into what he probably thought sounded contrite. "We wanted to come by and talk about the other day." I stepped aside, letting them in despite every instinct screaming not to. Sandra placed the flowers on the coffee table with the practiced precision of someone performing a gesture rather than feeling it. "We're sorry if things got heated," Sandra began, settling onto Elizabeth's chair like she belonged there. "Grief makes people say things they don't mean." "Exactly," David nodded, perching on the edge of the sofa. We all loved Elizabeth in our own way. The stress of losing her just brought out the worst in everyone. I watched them carefully, noting how neither of them could meet my eyes for more than a second, how Sandra's fingers drummed against her purse clasp. "Is that what you came to say?" "Well," David cleared his throat, "we also thought it might be a good time to discuss practical matters. Elizabeth's will, her belongings. I know it's difficult to think about, but these things need to be handled." Sandra leaned forward with practiced sympathy. As David's stepmother, Elizabeth was family, and we know she would want her things to go to people who cared about her. The audacity hit me like a physical blow. You want to discuss Elizabeth's inheritance? 3 days after calling her a burden at her own funeral? Dad, you're taking that completely out of context, David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. I was emotional, we all were. But that doesn't change the fact that I was technically her stepson. Legally, I might have some claim. Get out, I said quietly. Sandra blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out of my house. I stood slowly, my voice growing stronger with each word. You have the unmitigated gall to sit in her chair in the home where she suffered and died and ask about her inheritance? After calling her a burden? After saying she wasn't even your mother? David's mask slipped slightly. Look, Dad, I get that you're upset, but we're talking about potentially significant assets here. The house, her life insurance, her jewelry. Stop talking. The words came out like ice. Not only will you never see a penny of Elizabeth's inheritance, but you can stop counting on mine as well. 20 years of cleaning up your messes, of bailing you out, of being your personal bank, that's over. Sandra's composure cracked. You can't be serious. David is your son. You can't just cut him off because of one conversation. One conversation? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. One conversation where he called my dying wife a burden and said he was embarrassed by me caring for her. One conversation where he celebrated her death. I moved toward the door, opening it wide. You wanted to breathe freely? Congratulations. You're about to learn what it feels like to breathe without my money keeping you afloat. The only thing you need to work out is how you're going to pay your own bills from now on, because this safety net you've depended on your entire adult life just disappeared. David's face shifted, the mask slipping completely. I wouldn't be so quick to act tough, Dad. His voice turned cold, calculating. Because if I stop making payments, this house goes to auction. I felt the blood drain from my face. What are you talking about? Sandra's smile was razor sharp. Oh, honey, you were so busy playing nurse to Elizabeth that you clearly didn't read what you were signing. She opened her purse and pulled out a folded document. Remember when David needed that business loan last year? You co-signed for it. Your house is the collateral. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that day. Elizabeth had been having a particularly bad reaction to her dialysis, and I'd been rushing between the hospital and David's office, desperate to help my son get back on his feet while keeping my wife alive. The paperwork had been a blur of signatures and reassurances. $62,000, David said, watching my face carefully, plus interest. Missed 3 payments, and the bank takes everything. Your home, Elizabeth's garden, all those precious memories you're so fond of. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. So maybe you want to reconsider how quickly you cut off that safety net. Sandra stepped back beside him, her earlier panic replaced by cold satisfaction. So maybe you want to reconsider that conversation about inheritance, because it looks like we're all going to need each other after all. They walked away down the path, leaving me standing in the doorway as the weight of what I'd forgotten, what I'd willfully pushed from my mind during Elizabeth's final months, crashed down on me. I'd been so focused on her medical bills, so determined to save her, that I'd signed papers without thinking, trusted my son when I should have known better. As I closed the door, I realized they hadn't just underestimated what they were dealing with. I'd underestimated them too. The letter from First National Bank arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official red stamp burning like a brand across the white envelope. Notice of delinquency, screamed from the header in bold black letters. My hands trembled slightly as I read the details. David had missed the September payment, and they were demanding immediate action to avoid foreclosure proceedings. I set the letter on Elizabeth's kitchen table, the same table where she'd sorted her pills each morning, where we'd shared quiet breakfasts during her good days. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was using our home, her sanctuary, as a weapon against me. The audacity was breathtaking, and it told me everything I needed to know about the kind of war he wanted to fight. My phone buzzed. David's name flashed on the screen. Dad, I heard you might have gotten some mail from the bank. His voice carried that false concern he'd perfected over the years. Look, business has been tough lately. You know how it is. No, David, I don't know how it is. Explain it to me. I kept my voice level, but inside, something cold and calculating was taking shape. Well, the restaurant industry is brutal right now. Customer traffic is down, suppliers are demanding cash up front. His words tumbled out in practice sequence, the same excuses he'd used for years. I'm probably going to need another month or two to catch up on payments. Another month or two, I repeated slowly. And if you can't catch up, a pause. Too long. I'm sure we can work something out, Dad. Maybe you could help with just this one payment? For old time's sake? The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. I could picture him in his office, the one I'd helped him lease with furniture I'd co-signed for, calculating how much pressure to apply, how much false vulnerability to inject into his voice. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Margaret Caldwell at Caldwell and Associates, the law firm that had handled Elizabeth's will. Margaret's office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place that whispered competence and discretion. Let me understand this correctly, Margaret said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the loan documents David had left on my doorstep the night before, his not-so-subtle reminder of our situation. You co-signed for a business loan using your home as collateral, and now your son is deliberately defaulting to pressure you? That's exactly what's happening. The words felt strange in my mouth, admitting that my own son was extorting me. What are my options? Margaret's expression grew grim as she flipped through pages. Legally, you're responsible for this debt. If he defaults, the bank can and will foreclose on your home. She paused, studying my face. However, there might be grounds to challenge the validity of this agreement if you can prove you were coerced or misled about the terms. And if I can't prove that, then you're looking at losing your home unless you make the payments yourself. She leaned back in her chair. There is one other option, though it's drastic. You could sell the house yourself, pay off the loan, and eliminate his leverage entirely. The suggestion hit me like lightning. Sell the house. Sell Elizabeth's garden, her carefully chosen paint colors, the bedroom where she'd spent her final months. The thought should have been devastating, but instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. If I sell the house, what happens to the loan? The debt gets paid off from the proceeds. Your son loses his hold over you, but... Margaret hesitated. You also lose your home. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Elizabeth's last months, how she'd worried constantly about being a burden, how she'd apologized for the medical bills that I'd gladly paid. Then I thought about David's smirk at her funeral, his calculated cruelty, his assumption that I'd sacrifice anything to preserve her memory in this house. He thinks I'll cling to this place because of Elizabeth, I said slowly. He thinks grief makes me weak. And does it? I felt something shift inside me, the same transformation that had begun at the cemetery. No, it makes me dangerous. 2 hours later, I was back home with a stack of papers and Margaret's business card. The house felt different now, not like a sanctuary to be protected, but like a strategic asset to be deployed. I walked through each room, seeing it through a buyer's eyes instead of a mourner's heart. Elizabeth had always said this place was just wood and brick. What mattered was the love inside it. And I could take that love anywhere. By evening, I'd made 2 more calls. The first was to Henderson Realty. I'd known Tom Henderson for 15 years, and his preliminary assessment put the house value at $340,000, more than enough to pay off David's $62,000 loan and leave me with a substantial sum. The second call was to Margaret's recommended estate attorney. I need to revise my will, I told him, completely. Any particular changes you'd like to make? I looked around the living room at the photos of David's graduation, his wedding, the grandchildren I barely saw anymore. I want to leave everything to charity. Every penny. Make sure there's no ambiguity about it. That's quite a significant change. Are you certain? I've never been more certain of anything in my life. As I hung up, my phone buzzed again. David? Dad? Just checking in. Have you thought about helping with that payment? This time I smiled as I answered. Actually, yes. I've thought about it quite a lot. Great. I knew you'd come around. Family has to stick together, right? Absolutely, I said, my voice warm with false agreement. Family should definitely stick together. In fact, I've been thinking we should spend more time together. Maybe you should come by this weekend. There are some things I'd like to discuss. Sure, Dad. Whatever you need. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of Elizabeth's favorite wine, the bottle we'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. As I raised it in a silent toast to her memory, I realized David had made one crucial miscalculation. He thought he was manipulating a grief-stricken old man. He was about to discover he'd been dealing with someone else entirely. 3 weeks had passed since David's last threatening phone call, and the silence had been deliberate. Each day that ticked by without a payment was another twist of the knife he thought he was holding to my throat. What he didn't know was that I'd been using every one of those days. The for sale sign went up on a gray Thursday morning, positioned perfectly visible from the street. I watched from the kitchen window as neighbors slowed their morning walks to stare as Mrs. Henderson hurried over with concerned questions. I deflected with polite smiles. The sign felt like a declaration of war, clean, simple, and utterly devastating to anyone who understood what it meant. Tom Henderson had worked miracles in those 3 weeks. Despite my urgency, he'd managed to find serious buyers, and after some negotiation driven by my need for speed, we'd settled on $320,000. The papers were signed, the closing scheduled for the following Friday. All that remained was waiting for David to notice his carefully constructed trap had become his own cage. I didn't have to wait long. The screech of tires in my driveway announced his arrival at 2:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon. I'd been sitting in Elizabeth's chair, reading through the final sale documents, when David's BMW lurched to a stop with the kind of aggressive parking that spoke of barely controlled rage. Through the window, I watched him sit in the driver's seat for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel, his face a mask of fury even from this distance. When he finally emerged, his usually perfect appearance was disheveled, shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. He stormed up the walkway, not bothering to close his car door, and hammered on my front door with the side of his fist. "Dad, open this door right now." I took my time standing up, smoothing down my shirt, walking slowly to the entrance. When I opened the door, David pushed past me without invitation, whirling around to face me in the living room. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if seeing it for the first time, landing on the real estate documents scattered across the coffee table. "What the hell is this?" He snatched up the papers, his hands shaking as he scanned the legal language. "A sale contract? You're selling the house?" "Yes," I said simply, closing the front door with deliberate calm. "Closing is next Friday." "You can't do this." The words exploded out of him. "This is insane. You're throwing away everything, Elizabeth's memory, our family home, everything." I felt a cold satisfaction watching him unravel. This was the same man who'd called Elizabeth a burden, who'd smirked at her funeral, who'd calculated exactly how much psychological pressure to apply to control me. Now he stood in my living room, finally understanding that he'd miscalculated everything. "Our family home?" I repeated, my voice carrying just enough emphasis to make him flinch. "Interesting phrase, considering you called it embarrassing to have a father who cared for his sick wife in this very house." "That's not. You're twisting my words." David's face was flushing red, a vein visible at his temple. I was grieving. I wasn't thinking clearly. "You were thinking very clearly," I interrupted, moving to pour myself a glass of water from the kitchen and forcing him to follow me if he wanted to continue this conversation. Clear enough to show up drunk to Elizabeth's funeral, clear enough to ask about inheritance before she was even buried, clear enough to engineer this entire situation with the loan to manipulate me. David followed me into the kitchen, his movements sharp and agitated. "Look, maybe I handled things poorly, but this," he gestured wildly at the papers, "this is insane. You're destroying your own life to spite me." "I'm not destroying anything, David. I'm just refusing to be held hostage in my own home." I turned to face him, leaning back against the counter with studied casualness. "You wanted me to live in fear of losing this place. Instead, I'm choosing to leave it on my terms. But where will you go? What will you do? You're 64 years old, Dad. You can't just start over." The desperation in his voice was almost pitiful. I could see him calculating frantically, trying to find a new angle of attack, a new source of leverage. I'll be fine, David. The sale will leave me with enough money to buy a nice condo somewhere. Maybe travel a bit. Elizabeth always wanted to see the coast. The coast? His voice cracked slightly. You're talking about moving away? What about us? What about our relationship? I almost laughed at the audacity. Our relationship? You mean the one where you treat me like a personal ATM and call my wife a burden? That relationship? I didn't mean it. The words burst out of him, raw and desperate. I was angry. I was drinking. I said things I didn't mean. But you can't just throw away 39 years because of one bad day. One bad day? I set down my water glass with deliberate precision. David, you haven't visited this house in 6 months except to ask for money. You avoided Elizabeth's bedside when she was dying. You showed up drunk to her funeral and celebrated her death. And then you tried to blackmail me with my own home, which part of that was just one bad day. He was pacing now, like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Fine, I've made mistakes. But this isn't the answer. You sell this house, you pay off my loan, and then what? You think that makes you free? You think that solves anything? There was something in his tone, a new edge that made me straighten slightly. What are you trying to say, David? His pacing stopped abruptly. When he turned to face me, his expression had shifted from desperate to calculating, and I recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he was about to reveal he'd done something much worse than we'd discovered. I'm saying maybe you don't understand the full scope of what you're dealing with here, Dad. His voice had dropped to something quieter, more controlled, more dangerous. The business loan was just the beginning. Did you really think I'd put all my eggs in one basket? A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my expression neutral. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the second mortgage on this house that you co-signed for Sandra's business, the one from 18 months ago. Remember when you were so worried about Elizabeth's treatment that you barely read what you were signing? The world seemed to tilt slightly. I did remember, vaguely. Another stack of papers, another crisis, another time when I'd trusted my son and signed documents while rushing to get back to Elizabeth's side. $45,000, David continued, his confidence returning as he watched my face. So even if you sell this house for $320,000, after you pay off both loans, after realtor fees and taxes, what's left? Maybe $200,000? Enough for a small apartment somewhere if you're lucky. I felt like I was falling, but I forced myself to remain standing, to keep my expression blank. You're lying. Am I? David pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then showed me a screen. Even from across the kitchen, I could see the official letterhead, the dollar amounts, my signature at the bottom. Sandra's Bakery needed capital. You were so eager to help your family, so trusting. Did you really think we hadn't planned for the possibility that you might try something like this? The papers in his hand seemed to blur as I stared at them. 2 loans, 2 mortgages. I'd been so focused on the $62,000 that I'd forgotten about the smaller one, the one I'd signed in a haze of worry and exhaustion. So here's what's going to happen, David continued, his voice gaining strength as he watched me process this information. You're going to call your realtor and take the house off the market. You're going to apologize for this ridiculous tantrum. And you're going to go back to being the supportive father you've always been, because the alternative is losing everything anyway, but with nowhere to live. I stared at him, this man I'd raised, this person I'd sacrificed for, who was now standing in Elizabeth's kitchen threatening to make me homeless. The kitchen where she'd made pancakes on good days, where she'd sorted pills on bad ones, where she'd whispered that she loved me the night before she died. And if I refuse? David's smile was cold, triumphant. Then you lose the house anyway, but instead of having any money left over, you'll be flat broke. An old man with no home, no savings, and no family willing to help him. Is that really what Elizabeth would have wanted for you? The mention of Elizabeth's name in this context, used as a weapon against me, ignited something I'd been keeping carefully controlled. But instead of exploding, I felt an icy calm settle over me. You know what, David? I said quietly. You're absolutely right. Elizabeth wouldn't have wanted me to end up broke and homeless. His smile widened, thinking he'd won. That's why she took out a life insurance policy 18 months ago that neither you nor Sandra knew about. $500,000, to be exact. I watched his face change as I continued. She was worried about exactly this kind of situation, about you trying to use our generosity against us, so she made sure I'd be protected. It was a complete lie. Elizabeth had been too sick, too focused on treatment to think about life insurance in her final months. But David didn't know that, and the seed of doubt I'd just planted was already growing behind his eyes. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? You seem to have kept such careful track of our finances. I'm surprised you missed it. Maybe Sandra isn't as thorough as she thinks she is." I moved to the kitchen table, shuffling through some papers with deliberate casualness. "The payout should come through any day now, more than enough to cover your little loans and leave me quite comfortable." David's face had gone pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You want to bet your financial future on it?" I looked up at him, allowing a small smile to play at my lips. "Because if I'm not bluffing, then you've just threatened a man who's about to come into a lot of money. And if I am bluffing, well, you'll find out soon enough, won't you?" The silence stretched between us, filled with David's rapid breathing and the tick of Elizabeth's kitchen clock. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if he dared call what he thought might be my bluff. Finally, he straightened up, trying to regain some composure. "Fine. We'll see about that insurance policy, but in the meantime, you're not selling this house. I'll be watching." "Watch all you want," I said mildly. "The closing is still scheduled for next Friday." "Not if I have anything to say about it." "And what exactly are you going to do, David? Show up at the lawyer's office? Explain to everyone there how you've been extorting your recently widowed father?" I stood up slowly, meeting his eyes directly. "Please, I'd love to see that conversation." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working silently, before turning abruptly and storming toward the front door. "This isn't over, Dad. Not even close." "I'm counting on it," I called after him. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, followed by the screech of tires as David tore out of the driveway. I stood in the sudden silence of my kitchen, my heart pounding, sweat beating on my forehead despite the cool air. The truth was, I had no idea if there was actually a second mortgage. David could have been lying, trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. Or he could have been telling the truth, in which case I was about to make a financial mistake that would leave me destitute. But as I looked around Elizabeth's kitchen, at the sunny yellow walls she'd painted during her remission, at the herbs growing on the windowsill that she'd never see bloom, I realized something. I didn't care. David thought he could use my love for this place against me, but he'd misunderstood what that love actually meant. Elizabeth wasn't in these walls. She was in my memories, in the lessons she'd taught me about dignity and strength. And she'd never have wanted me to live as a prisoner in my own home, held hostage by a son who saw her death as an opportunity. I walked to the phone and dialed Tom Henderson's number. "Tom? It's Robert. I just wanted to confirm. The closing is still set for next Friday, correct? Good. And Tom, if anyone calls asking questions about the sale, especially my son, you have my permission to tell them exactly where they can go." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The man who'd stood crying over Elizabeth's grave was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best way to honor her memory wasn't to cling to the past, but to refuse to let anyone turn her love into a weapon. David wanted a war. He was about to get one, but he'd chosen the wrong battlefield and underestimated the wrong opponent. The house might be going up for sale, but the real fight was just beginning. The law office of Caldwell & Associates felt charged with tension on Friday morning. I sat at the conference table, closing documents spread before me, watching Margaret Caldwell review each page. Across from me sat the buyers, the Hendersons, a young couple with nervous smiles who had no idea they were about to witness the final act of a family war. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Walker," Margaret said. "We're just waiting for the final wire confirmation, then we can proceed." I checked my watch. 10:47 a.m. I'd arrived early, hoping to complete the transaction before David realized what was happening. The conference room door burst open at exactly 10:52 a.m. David strode in like he owned the place, Sandra close behind, both dressed for battle. David's face was flushed with rage, while Sandra maintained that practiced composure I'd learned to recognize as her most dangerous state. "Stop this right now," David announced. "This sale cannot proceed." Margaret looked up calmly. "And you are?" "David Walker, this man's son. I'm here to inform you that my father is not of sound mind to make this transaction." The Hendersons exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm. "David," I said calmly, not rising from my seat, "you're not welcome here. Dad, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. You're selling Elizabeth's house, throwing away everything, and for what? To spite me?" Sandra stepped forward, her voice honey smooth. "Robert has been under tremendous stress since his wife's passing. We're worried about his decision-making." Margaret's expression hardened. "Walker is my client, and I can assure you he's been thoroughly counseled. Unless you have legal standing." "Legal standing?" David pulled out a thick folder. "My father co-signed for loans totaling over $100,000 using this house as collateral. This sale will leave those loans underwater." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should postpone." "No," I said firmly. "We're proceeding as scheduled." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own folder. "Margaret, would you please read the document on top?" Margaret scanned the contents, eyebrows rising. "This is a certified letter from First National Bank dated yesterday, confirming full satisfaction of business loan number 847-332-9981 in the amount of $62,417. David's face went white. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I smiled. "While you were threatening me with foreclosure, I liquidated Elizabeth's pension fund. The loan is paid, David. Your leverage is gone." Sandra's composure cracked. "You can't do that. That money was meant for the estate." "According to whom? You? The woman who celebrated my wife's death?" David was struggling to process this. "The second mortgage, Sandra's bakery loan." "Doesn't exist," I said simply. "I checked. Thoroughly. You were bluffing." His mask finally slipped completely. "You spiteful old man. You're destroying our family over what? Because I said some things when I was grieving?" "Grieving?" I laughed without humor. "You showed up drunk to Elizabeth's funeral and told me you were relieved she was dead. That's not grief, David. That's cruelty. She wasn't my mother. No, but she was my wife, the woman who worried about being a burden while you treated her like one, and you used her death to extort me." Sandra tried to interject. "Robert, you're being emotional. Don't you dare tell me how to feel about my wife." My voice was steel. "You spent 2 years avoiding this house because her illness made you uncomfortable. You complained about her medications, her walker, how depressing it was to visit someone dying." I looked back at David. "Elizabeth told me the night before she died that she was worried about you. Not angry, worried. She hoped you'd learn what real love looked like." David's jaw worked silently. "She was wrong to worry," I continued. "You're 39 years old. If you haven't learned empathy by now, you never will." "So what?" Sandra's voice cracked with desperation. "You're cutting off your only son over money?" "I'm refusing to be the foundation for your house of lies and entitlement. You want to build a life? Build it on your own efforts." I turned to Margaret. "The loan is satisfied. Can we proceed?" Before Margaret could answer, David made a desperate play. "The buyers. You don't want this family drama. Find another house." Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by speaking up firmly. "Actually, we've been looking for months. This house is perfect, and watching Mr. Walker handle this with such dignity makes us more confident in our decision." David stared in disbelief. "Anyone can see he's doing the right thing," she continued. "I'd have done the same." Margaret seized the moment. "If we're ready, I have wire confirmation. Mr. Walker, if you'll sign here." For 20 minutes, David and Sandra stood like spectators at their own defeat while I signed document after document. With each signature, I felt lighter. This wasn't loss, it was liberation. When the last document was notarized, Margaret stood. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. The transfer is complete." I shook her hand, then turned to the Hendersons. "Take care of her gardens. Elizabeth planted the roses herself." As I gathered my documents, David made one final attempt. "Dad, please, we can work this out." I stopped at the door and looked back, really looked at him, seeing not the son I'd raised, but the man he'd chosen to become. You chose this ending when you celebrated Elizabeth's death, when you tried to use her memory as a weapon. I paused. The loan is paid. We have no financial ties. After today, we have no ties at all. You can't mean that, Sandra whispered. I mean every word. I opened the door. Oh, and David, you might want to start reading documents before you sign them. I hear there can be unexpected consequences. I walked out, leaving behind the wreckage of a relationship poisoned by greed and cruelty. In my pocket was a cashier's check for $257,583, what remained after all fees. More importantly, it was freedom. Freedom from David's manipulations, from being used by people who saw love as weakness to exploit. As I walked to my car, I could hear them arguing behind me, probably blaming each other for their failed scheme. I didn't care. For the first time in years, David's problems were not my problems. The man who had grieved at Elizabeth's grave was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be used. The war was over. I had won, but more importantly, I was finally free. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. And as always, thank you for watching.